In just 16 years, adults 65 and older will outnumber children for the first time in U.S. history. And we also have an aging rainbow nation. According to a study by SAGE, that Services and Advocacy for LGBT elders, there are at least 3 million LGBT people over 55 in the USA, and that number is going to double in 20 years. Here to help us figure out what that means in terms of health for LGBT communities in Minnesota is Phil Duran. He is Legal Director, Healthcare Access for JustUs Health. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So tell me a little bit more about JustUs Health. And when we say that, it's JUSTUS.
Yes, exactly. So JustUs Health is a relatively new organization, but it was created in 2018 by putting together 3 organizations that had been around for many years. So the Minnesota AIDS Project, Rainbow Health Initiative, and Training to Serve. Minnesota AIDS Project goes back 35 years. Its focus, of course, HIV and AIDS. The Rainbow Health Initiative was created in around 2000 to address more general health issues within the LGBT communities. And Training to Serve was created about 10 years ago to help provide training to adult service providers on how best to work with LGBT seniors. And so today our work together continues the focus on HIV, LGBTQ health, and aging in both contexts.
And so, but when you talk about Training to Serve, and you now have like 12,000 people out there that train, you need to let all kinds of people know about an aging LGBT community, because we weren't thinking about that a couple of years ago.
True.
Now we're all here.
Absolutely. One of the things that the statistic that we like to talk about is, as you kind of referred to, in the roughly 10 years that Training to Serve has existed, Training to Serve has provided education to over 12,000 individuals across Minnesota who are employed in the service sector of serving serving older adults, and how best to serve the LGBT folks that are coming in. We talk about the boomers, and the generation before that was often referred to as the silent generation, and perhaps because of the times that they grew up in. A lot of folks in that generation just accept the world as it is and accommodate themselves to it. And so if you're LGBT and you're in that generation, your default setting may very well be to just not talk about your sexual orientation or your gender identity, to go back into the closet, to do whatever you need to do. Boomers have taken a different approach to life in the past 50, 60 years and have said, not a chance, we're going to get the services that we need on our terms. And those are the people who are coming into that system. And so one of the things that we hope to do is to really help lay the groundwork through education and training and familiarization so that folks are ready and able to serve that population well.
Well, let's talk about some of the challenges, and then we'll get to some of the solutions.
Absolutely.
So some of the challenges that some of the folks are facing, what do you see it in general, and then what do you see it in Minnesota?
I would say that in general, Minnesota experiences do line up with the national experiences. There's maybe one area that I'll highlight where I think there's a difference and where I think we do a really very good job. There are a number of challenges that will happen, but one of the things that comes to mind for us at JustUs Health is that LGBT older folks often don't have access to the same kinds of support networks that many older adults experience and take for granted. Oftentimes they do not have a partner. Oftentimes they do not have children. Their families may be separated from them, not only in terms of geography, but in terms of emotional distance as well. Many older LGBT folks were simply rejected by their families of origin because of their sexual orientation or because of their gender identity. Oftentimes older adults will turn to communities of faith for support and community, and as I'm sure you know, that relationship between communities of faith and LGBT folks has been very fraught over the years. There's a tremendous amount of growth and change, but there's still that background, and so isolation is a tremendous concern for LGBT individuals and even couples. Even if you do have a partner, you may stay inside and not interact with the world because you're afraid of what's going to happen. These are the folks who are often alone, who are often forgotten, quite honestly. And one of the challenges that we hope to address as we continue to incorporate Training to Serve within our programs and build on them is how can we help? How can we help address that kind of isolation? And honestly, as I've said in other contexts, this is kind of a wake-up call for the LGBT community. We've not always had very good discussions about what it means to age as an LGBT person. And now we really have to. And I think JustUs Health is really in a position to help shape that conversation, to lead that conversation, so that when the younger folks today get to be older folks tomorrow, their experience may be vastly improved.
Is that because there's been a real youth-centric look or feel to a lot of these communities?
I think it's true, and we have to acknowledge that. When you think about Pride celebrations, for example, and you see it on TV, you know, what is the news coverage? It's usually people dancing, they're on floats, they're doing all kinds of crazy things. It's not the 70-year-old person who's arrived at Loring Park in their scooter.
Right.
That's just not your image of that. And yet, Diana,
but it's there.
It is
coming.
absolutely
Yeah.
there. And in fact, it's there right now. When our tent was set up at Pride in Loring Park in 2018, we were across the sidewalk from the AARP tent, which had some of the best music in the park. And just beyond the AARP tent was this area of the park called Boomertown, which is focused on older adults and making sure that it's accessible and making sure it's a little bit more quiet, an opportunity for folks to enjoy the event. But you're right, the kind of default vision that I think a lot of folks have of LGBT people is those kids, and it's everybody.
So now let's put the trans community in there as well, so the challenges they face.
Well, actually, you know, your question earlier about is there something that's any different about Minnesota? And this is actually an area where I think Minnesota has the ability to do much better than a lot of other communities. Minneapolis was the first city in the country to provide anti-discrimination protections for trans people, and we did that in 1975. St. Paul attempted to follow suit in 1978. It got a little bit hairy. Minnesota was the first state to provide anti-discrimination protections for transgender people in 1993, over 25 years ago. And so Minnesota has a relatively progressive and welcoming image for a lot of folks in the trans community, and we've built on that. There's, in our experience, whether it's in the aging context, whether it's in schools, whether it's in a lot of other contexts, Minnesota institutions do seem open and receptive to learning and to hearing and to improving the way that they do things. And so I think a lot of trans folks do have a good experience here in Minnesota. That being said, that's also very much a metro kind of phenomenon. There's a study that came out recently from AARP which suggested that nationally at least, transgender people live disproportionately in small town USA, which means they're not in the rainbow bubble between 694 and 494.
Right.
They're in greater Minnesota, where their options may be fewer, where their concerns may be greater that they'll be mistreated. And that's really the big fear among so many transgender people.
Mistreated and not accepted.
Mistreated, not accepted, and perhaps cut off from access to the kinds of health care that they've taken for granted as far as part of being part of their gender transition. One of the component organizations of JustUs Health conducted or participated in a study a number of years ago called the Trans Aging Project, and talked to trans older adults throughout Minnesota about their experiences. And across the board, there was, I hate to say the word terror, but it seems close, at the prospect of being institutionalized, of being vulnerable, of needing to depend on other people for health care because of the tremendous fear that they wouldn't be accepted, they'd be harmed in some fashion or another.
Is this because of past experience and they just didn't want it to play out again?
Partly that. It's partly the stories that they hear other people talking about. It can just be a default fear. And there have been some, including here in the Twin Cities, there have been some very highly publicized incidents of transgender people going to hospitals and having extremely, extremely painful experiences there. So it's not that it's simply made up. But what it can mean is that whether we're talking about trans folks or LGBT folks generally, if that fear is there, they are the sort of folks who will often simply not seek care. And so if something is going wrong with them, they'll just sit on it and hope it goes away or hope it gets better, because the last thing they want to do is to go to the doctor, go to the clinic, go to the hospital, and fear that, which means that whatever that health condition is, it just snowballs to the point where it can become a crisis.
So we've talked about some of the challenges. Let's talk about some of the solutions.
Sure.
What do we need to know going forward?
Going forward, one of the things, again, that JustUs Health will pick up from Training to Serve in the older adults context, but also will continue the work of Rainbow Health Initiative, which, and frankly, the Minnesota AIDS Project. All of these organizations have provided education and training to healthcare providers. It's not it's not going in and saying, let's tell you all the things you're doing wrong and waving the finger at them. And that's just not how it works. We go in and say, we know that you're in this profession because you care, you want to help. Here's a population that's having some difficulties. Let's help you do the best job you possibly can for this population, LGBT folks, people with HIV. And that's going to continue, that's going to expand. And really, I think Rainbow Health and Training to Serve, really their DNA brings into this organization such a statewide focus that I think we're excited to build on. And as you've talked about, this demographic shift in the coming years provides an opportunity to really engage those conversations. It's not hypothetical. It's not the situation that it might have been, say, 10 years ago, where we say, well, someday you might find an LGBT person showing up at your door. They're here. It's now. Let us help. And there's such a hunger for this information. There really are so few resources here in Minnesota for providing this kind of information. And that's where I think we're going to see tremendous growth in our services, is really helping folks understand.
Let's talk about your health clinic,
Sure.
because then that's also an area where people can go for counseling services that might not be covered under Medicaid.
Yep, exactly. So one of the things that has come about as a result of this merger, it was driven by a philosophy that said, together we can do more than we can apart. And so one of the first manifestations of that has been the opening of a behavioral health clinic in St. Paul on University Avenue. And the services that we provide there are counseling, therapy, behavioral health services, and they're available to folks in the LGBT community, in particular, people affected by HIV/AIDS, and who may have a difficulty even with paying for those services. And one of the things that we're seeing is that some of the historic providers of those kinds of mental health services to older adults are pulling back out of that market, or are simply just not taking more clients, or simply pulling out altogether, because Medicare reimbursement rates are so poor that they can no longer really afford to do it. And so we're seeing this upsurge in older LGBT adults who need those services, whose traditional providers aren't available to them anymore. And so we've got the doors open, and we've got a tremendous team at the clinic right now who are providing those services and engaging interns from the schools across the Twin Cities. It's a great team, and so folks should feel free to contact us if they're looking for more information.
Again, it's on University,
Yes,
at
exactly.
1000 University. Okay, so here's our trivia bit. So in case you didn't know, lay one on me here.
Lay one on you. All
What's coming
right.
up?
Here's the trivia for the day. It's 2019. It is the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots in New York City that are considered to be the beginning of the modern LGBT rights movement. There were certainly activists prior to that, but that's the thing that seems to have kind of kicked off the modern movement. That was 50 years ago this summer.
In June.
And I would imagine in June, and that's why prides typically happen in June. And I think if you were to look at the coverage of that original event, you'd see all of these young hippies, long hair and beards and all this stuff in the streets of New York City. Those people are all on Medicare right now. Those are our folks, and those are the people that we're fighting to help make sure have a good experience as older adults.
And so just a little bit of a lookout,
Sure.
Put on your calendar. So Gay Pride in Minnesota might back up a week to honor what's happening in New York?
That's exactly right. So New York, being New York, they have kind of laid claim to the last weekend of June, and so cities across the country, including the Twin Cities, will be moving their celebrations. So normally we're on the last weekend of June. This time we're on the weekend prior to that, so June 22nd and 23rd. So if there are folks who are interested, they should stop by Loring Park that weekend. Boomertown is the area for older folks, and that's typically in the northeast corner of the park. And they can find us there, they can find AARP there, they can find a lot of different services and supports there.
Okay, Phil, thank you so much
Thanks
for joining me. I really appreciate it. This is the first time we've had a chance to sit down and talk, and I'm really glad to have met you. I agree. Let's do this again.
Sounds good.
Again, for more information on how you can contact JustUs Health, just go to www.justushealth.mn.